Good evening and welcome to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller, the creator of this podcast, and what you are about to hear is a short teaser for the latest bonus episode. As you may or may not know, Dead Sleep is 100% ad-free and listener-supported. That means it really does rely on you, the listener, to succeed. If you would like to ensure the success of this podcast and enjoy a subscriber-only bonus episode each month, please feel free to subscribe via Spotify, Patreon, and Apple Podcasts. Just a few dollars a month really does make a difference in covering the essential production costs in making this podcast. Thank you for supporting my work, and I hope my work supports you. You can enjoy a free month on Apple Podcasts and a free 7-day trial on Patreon. Thank you. And now, on to the teaser of the latest bonus episode. Good evening. This is the January 2026 bonus episode of Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. It's Nancy, of course. Thank you so much for supporting this podcast. A quick shout out to a listener named Valerie R., who suggested a story idea that ultimately led me to want to cover this particular case. And that's all I'll say about it, except that it's drawn in part from a book that came out all the way back in 1981, written by a pretty well-known journalist at that time, named Joan Bartel. And the title of the book is A Death in California, a true account of love and murder among the very rich. Though as you'll hear tonight, it's about much, much more than that. This is, of course, the Dead Sleep version of events, factual, but shaped to be appropriate for nighttime listening. I will link to the original in the show notes if you'd like to know the full story. Speaking of full story, a quick correction on an error I made in the previous episode. It's an episode titled When Darkness Falls. And in that episode, I noted that the tallest mountain peak in the United States is Mount Whitney in California. And that is incorrect. The tallest peak in the United States is in Alaska. That's Mount Denali. So the correct way to frame this is that Mount Whitney is the highest peak in the contiguous United States. Contiguous, that means neighboring, adjacent. And it's Denali. That's the peak that is the highest in all of the United States. Thank you so much to the listener who noted that error, and I really appreciate it. And now on to tonight's saga, which also takes place in California, not too far from Mount Whitney as the crow flies, but a completely different environment. Not a mountainous peak, but a rural patch of San Joaquin Valley, an area just outside the city of Visalia, which is in central California, which was back in 1973, when our story takes place, was still just a small town surrounded by abundant natural beauty. Mighty oaks and giant sequoia trees, with acres and acres of family farms and ranch land. The paradise of the San Joaquin Valley was just a 3-hour drive away from the grime and crime of early 1970s Los Angeles, where the general sentiment was back then, if the smog didn't kill you, maybe a serial killer would. Not that LA's pollution problem or escalating homicide rate affected Hope Masters much. Hope was born and raised in Beverly Hills. And while Hope, of course, knew bad things happened, they happened all the time. She didn't believe in actual evil. She believed that most people were good, and some less than good. But evil, as if some people were predestined to be irredeemably wicked, cruel just for the sake of being cruel. Hope didn't really believe in that. No doubt that was because for nearly all of her life, everybody was nice to Hope. Who couldn't be nice to Hope Masters? Well, maybe some women, but Hope understood that was because they were just jealous. Because Hope was known in the upper echelon of high society as the pretty, wealthy, blonde socialite from Beverly Hills, with the world, more or less, at her feet. And true, Hope was 31 years old, with 3 children, ranging in ages from a toddler to a preteen. She looked, and sometimes acted, closer to 21 years old. Sometimes she was even mistaken for a teenager. Part of that was her demeanor, but it was also her size. Hope Masters was small, just 5 feet tall, less than 100 pounds. Sometimes she wore her 12-year-old son's jeans if her clothes were dirty. Or rather, if her live-in maid didn't have her laundry ready. Yes, it appeared Hope lived a charmed and pampered life. But somewhere deep down, Hope knew she was not realizing her full potential. That she was capable of much more, including being capable of taking care of herself. After all, she took care of her children, and just as often, her own emotionally fragile mother, who went by the name Honey. But so far, thanks to a loyal coterie of male admirers, Hope really never had to worry about looking after herself. Not really. Whenever she was lonely, or bored, thirsty, or hungry, there were any number of available men, or rather men who made themselves available for whatever Hope needed. This included her soon-to-be ex-husband Tom, and her future husband, her fiancé, a man named Bill, who Hope fell in love with and agreed to marry as soon as her divorce from Tom was final. It was supposed to be in a matter of weeks. So it's fair to say, up until one Sunday afternoon in late February of 1973, Hope had no reason to believe evil existed, because she'd never seen it. But now, standing in the middle of a vast empty field, just outside of Visalia, California, but far, far away from Beverly Hills, Hope wondered if she might reconsider her worldview. Not that she saw evil. She just felt it. An awareness of a man with a gun aimed at the center of her back. Honestly, she wouldn't know for certain if this man was evil until he pulled the trigger. And by then, of course, it would be too late. He was no doubt a good shot. And Hope, she'd be dead. Knowing these moments were likely her last, Hope took in what was in front of her, trying to replace this feeling of terror with fleeting flashes of beauty. It was late February, so it was still chilly around these parts near the Sierra foothills. But there were signs of spring. The first blush of the bright orange California poppies. A spiky smattering of purple owl's clover. And if she could just steady her breath, she could take in the sweet, subtle smell of the blossoms on the nearby almond trees, gently blowing in the breeze. This was it. The time for begging and bargaining and pleading. It was done. That was over. Hope, she understood. He was going to kill her right here, right now, in broad daylight. The sun shining down on this open meadow on a Sunday afternoon, soft and bright and warm, blissfully unaware of all of the pain and suffering in the world right in front of it. Just like Hope Masters was. A matter of hours, days ago. But even after everything she'd been through, the shock, the pain, the terror, the betrayal, Hope was still a California girl. And she forced herself to look at the bright side. At least, she thought grimly, this is a nice place to die. And then she listened, above the tranquil sounds of nature, for the sound of the killer she couldn't see, but she knew was there. A sound she only really knew from the movies. A simple, single click. Just before he'd pulled the trigger. Right up until that eerie moment of silence in that field, the life of Hope Masters was a cacophony of chaos. The sounds of modern life in the early 1970s. The sound of AM radio and morning cartoons. Hers was a life of kids and commitments, activities and obligations. A world Hope sought to escape, just for a little while. A glorious weekend she had planned with her fiancé, Bill Ashlock. The two would venture up to the family's ranch just outside of Visalia, and they'd have a wonderful weekend. And that Friday morning, as Hope sat in her Beverly Hills home, fantasizing as she enjoyed her morning breakfast of a cigarette, a cup of black coffee, and a handful of vitamins just to keep it healthy. Like an old commercial from the 70s, Bill and Hope together, riding horseback, in slow motion, her blonde hair flowing in the breeze. Then they'd settle in by the fireplace, drink Chablis, and toast to the fact that they'd found each other. And for Hope, after 2 failed marriages before the age of 30, she knew with Bill, the 3rd time was the charm. Throughout Hope's life, she sought more than a partner. For her, men were a portal, a window through which she could escape the life she no longer wanted and gain access and resources to the life she desired next. When she was 16, Hope ran away with the boy next door as an escape from her neurotic and controlling mother, who was also named Hope, but who everyone called Honey. Honey came from a wealthy patrician oil family, and she dressed in the finest designer clothing, wearing Chanel suits to her lunch dates at the local country club. Honey was as blue-blooded as it got in California. Blue bloods being a term to describe American aristocracy, such as it was, which meant skin pale enough for the blue veins to show through. Though this being California, Honey's skin was a golden hue, just a kiss of bronze to go with her blonde hair. Not too much. But years earlier, before she became a high society matron, Honey had made the mistake of falling for a jazz musician, Hope's father. Though the marriage didn't last, and Hope barely knew her father. And eventually Honey married the appropriate, wealthy, and successful man. The man who would become Hope's stepfather, who Hope couldn't stand. Honey was desperate for Hope not to make the same mistake she did. So Honey had big plans for Hope. As a kid, she was going to attend Westlake, one of LA's most elite private schools. Then, when she graduated, she'd head off to Stanford, the Ivy League of the West. Eventually, she'd marry someone as rich and successful as her stepfather and return to LA to be Honey's mini-me. Hope had other ideas. After marrying the boy next door secretly at 16, she got pregnant, dropped out of high school, and the two moved into a tiny studio apartment with a single mattress on the floor as furniture. But the boy next door was also from a prominent family, and ultimately, Hope's plan to escape her mother, it backfired. Hope and her husband would somehow spend more time with Honey and her stepfather than ever. Everything from tennis at the club to playing bridge. This was not the life Hope wanted. And by 23, Hope filed for divorce. And by her mid-20s, she was a single mother with 2 children, and she decided she wanted a life that was more glamorous, less domestic. Her next husband, Tom Masters, fit the bill. A dashing 24-year-old who had his own PR firm. Tom was everything her boy next door was not. Tom was cool and suave and took Hope to the kinds of bars and restaurants that other people would have to wait in line to get into, if they got in at all. But once Hope got pregnant with their son, Casey, she realized with Tom, his cool factor turned ice cold. For Hope, the pendulum had swung too far the other way. Tom resisted domestic life and even appeared envious of Hope's relationships with her own children. Tom also became more critical and controlling. He wanted to decide what she wore and how much makeup to wear. Hope was a natural beauty, but Tom wanted her to put on heavy eye makeup and slashes of rouge. Hope would soon realize he didn't want a wife. He wanted a prop. A flashy broad on his arm, Hope later said. And so that's what she became. Hope was also uncomfortable with what she saw as Tom's dark side. He was obsessed, fixated on the Tate LaBianca murders. And when it all happened, in 1969, Tom read everything he could about those grisly deaths, Most especially, his focus was on the savagery in the murder of Sharon Tate. He appeared to have a macabre fascination of how a woman so beautiful could die so brutally. Eventually, Hope also realized that he wasn't as successful as he'd made himself out to be. Tom was in PR, what he called the image business, and Hope realized a lot of what he said he was a mirage. She knew he owed people money, and more than once, Hope remembered she had to bail him out with her own money, which wasn't really her own, but a trust fund that was set up by her grandparents before they died. A fund that for some reason, her mother, Honey, still controlled. So while it appeared Hope had everything, a cute house in Beverly Hills, a live-in maid, all of that was paid for by her mother, with Hope's so-called allowance just barely enough to scrape by. Nobody at her mother's country club would have believed that Hope, the so-called heiress, sometimes worked side jobs to make ends meet, cocktail waitressing, telemarketing. And Hope was likely the only woman in Beverly Hills with a live-in maid who qualified for food stamps. Separated from her husband, Hope didn't have a credit card. This was 1973, where women were still discriminated against when they applied for financial services like credit cards and loans. It would be another year, 1974, before a crucial piece of legislation was passed called the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, ensuring women like Hope could acquire credit cards and loans in their own names, regardless of marital status. But being a broke blue blood was one of many of Hope Masters' contradictions. How she was both rich and also poor, a mother often treated as a child, an extrovert who claimed to be an open book, but mercurial and impossible to really read, a socialite who could act like an imperious snob one minute, then profoundly generous the next. When one young woman, a former live-in maid, showed up on Hope's doorstep all alone and pregnant, Hope took her in, gave her a place to stay for free, and even took her to the hospital, staying with her so she wouldn't give birth to her baby alone. The many men who loved Hope, they would say she was opaque. It was impossible to ever really know what she was thinking or what she really wanted. And maybe that was all part of Hope's calculated mystique, something that kept men interested. But more likely, it was because Hope didn't really know herself. She was a woman with too many options. Even after she'd married Tom, the men who adored her kept calling those first few months to let her know if anything didn't work out, they'd be waiting. And well, it didn't work out. But Hope held off on moving forward with a divorce because she knew if she divorced right away, someone else would have come along. And in what she described as an emotional burst of enthusiasm, Hope feared she would have just gone off and gotten married again. Out of the frying pan and into the fire. And this was perhaps her most fateful contradiction. How Hope was a woman with so many options, but no real sense of a future. That is until she met Bill Ashlock. Now, they hadn't known each other very long, just a couple of months, but she believed Bill was the one who could help her fit all of those jagged pieces into one seamless picture. Bill Ashlock, Hope's fiancé. He wasn't just another way out. Hope believed that Bill was a way home, a place where she belonged. From the night they met at a Christmas party, Bill was kind and generous, honest and real. And over these past couple of months, Hope felt he appreciated her, even with her many contradictions. He'd also formed a strong bond with her children almost immediately. Her older kids loved spending time with him, and her 3-year-old, Casey. He and Bill had a little routine, a very 1970s routine, where 3-year-old Casey would sit on Bill's lap as Bill sipped his nightly gin and tonic, and Casey would sip his own version, a small glass with club soda and a bit of lime, just like Bill's. And Bill's children from his previous marriage, they seemed to blend in effortlessly. Bill worked in advertising, and he made a good living. But even on his good salary, finances were going to be tight once they got married. Bill was divorced, which meant he not only had to pay a fair amount in alimony and child support to his wife and their 2 kids, he also paid rent for his own apartment downtown, as he and Hope planned for their future. Bill loved Hope, and he would have shouted from the rooftops that they were getting married. But Hope wanted to be discreet. She and Tom, her second husband, soon to be ex-second husband, they'd been separated for 2 years. But their divorce was only now about to come through. And in Beverly Hills society, Hope didn't want to make any announcements until that divorce was final. A matter of weeks. And once this divorce was finalized, Tom would also now have to pay her money. She wasn't asking for a lot, but she needed a few $100 extra a month to help take care of their son, Casey, which Hope didn't think would be a problem. But she couldn't help but notice. Since Bill came into their lives, Tom suddenly seemed more interested in their son, Casey. And instead of coming by just once a week, every Saturday, as he typically did, he dropped by earlier that week, on Wednesday night, with a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken. And he stayed for a little while before he mentioned that he had to go meet someone at the bar of the Beverly Hilton Hotel. This, at the time, surprised Hope. The Beverly Hilton Hotel. That was not the kind of place where a guy like Tom would typically be seen. As a mover and shaker, especially in PR, Tom wanted to be seen at the Playboy Club, the Beverly Hills Polo Lounge, but the Beverly Hilton. And when Hope scoffed at where he was headed, Tom just shrugged it off. It was just a drink, Tom said. Hope didn't press further. Maybe she should have. But Hope was too preoccupied with her upcoming weekend with Bill and making final arrangements, which included reminding Tom that he had to pick up and drop off Casey on Saturday, that she would be with Bill at the ranch. She sensed Tom was agitated by all of this, but she let it pass. She was moving on. And by Friday morning, all she was thinking about was her trip with Bill. And then, at around 10:30 that Friday morning, the phone rang. Hope's new maid, Marta, who Hope didn't know very well, answered the phone, and she let Hope know it was Mr. Bill, and he had some important information for her. When Hope got on the phone, She wasn't sure what he was going to say. He was supposed to be here in a matter of hours to pick her up for their trip, and she prayed that nothing had come up at the last minute. Bill said he had some exciting news. Well, it was maybe exciting news. He had to make sure that she was okay with it. A reporter from the LA Times had called that morning, and this reporter, he was working on a story about the 10 most eligible bachelors in Los Angeles. And somehow he found out about Bill and wanted to know if Bill was interested in being featured in the LA Times piece. Hope was a little surprised and also amused. "The thing is, Bill," she said, "you're not an eligible bachelor anymore." Bill said, of course. He knew that. But they hadn't announced their engagement yet, and being featured in this article would be great for his ad business. But of course, he didn't want to give anyone the wrong idea, and he didn't want this to jeopardize their relationship. So again, if she had a problem with it, he'd skip it and he'd turn the reporter down. Hope thought it sounded hilarious. He should go and get his ego stroked, go out to lunch with that reporter, give him a great interview, and he did not need to mention Hope at all. She was completely fine if, in the life of Bill Ashlock, nobody knew that Hope even existed. Was she sure? Bill asked. Yes, Hope said she was sure. She said she loved him, she'd see him in a few hours, and she couldn't wait to go on this trip. And then as time passed, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and Bill didn't show up at her house, she grew worried. If he didn't get here soon, they wouldn't make it to the ranch by nightfall. And then came another unexpected phone call. It was Bill again, and this time he sounded even more excited than before. He apologized and explained to Hope that he and this reporter, the reporter's name was Taylor Wright, the two, they got along thick as thieves. And what was supposed to be an hour lunch turned into a 5-hour conversation. And in their conversation, he talked all about Hope, and he confided that soon enough he wouldn't be a bachelor anymore. And this reporter, he didn't seem to mind. He was still going to feature him in the article, this roundup of the 10 LA bachelors. Wasn't that great? But there was one favor Bill had to ask Hope. Taylor said he needed a few photographs, and he was on a deadline. So would Hope mind if on Saturday, this reporter and a photographer came to the ranch just to snap a few photos? It won't take long, and then they can go back to their romantic weekend. Would that be okay? Hope, she wasn't wild about the idea, but of course she said yes. And Bill, he was so grateful. And after this photo shoot, he promised his future bride that he would do whatever it took to make sure their special weekend would be one they would never, ever forget. And by that Sunday afternoon, sun dappling on that meadow, the gun aimed at Hope's back, well, you had to hand it to Bill Ashlock. He was a man of his word. she would remember this weekend for the rest of her life. No matter how many more seconds that might be.